The air in courtroom 3C of the Jefferson County Family Court was heavy with the weight of routine injustice, the kind that settled into the bones of everyone who passed through its double oak doors. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow across the worn wooden benches where families huddled, their faces etched with worry and resignation. The walls, painted a faded institutional beige, bore the scuffs and scratches of decades of human struggle custody battles, restraining orders, juvenile hearings. The faint smell of old paper and stale coffee lingered, mingling with the nervous sweat of those awaiting judgment. It was 9:17 a.m. on a humid July morning in 2025, and the docket promised another long day of navigating the fragile hopes of those who believed, or at least prayed, that justice might still be found here. At the front of the room, behind a polished mahogany bench, sat Judge Michael Carter, 53, a man whose presence seemed to anchor the chaos of the courtroom. His black robe hung loosely over his slender frame, but his authority was palpable, radiating not from his physical stature but from the quiet intensity of his dark eyes. Those eyes, framed by wire-rimmed glasses, scanned the case file before him with the precision of a surgeon. His weathered hands, marked by years of turning pages and shaking hands with grieving parents, paused on the name of the defendant, Aaliyah Thompson, age 12, charged with disorderly conduct, for allegedly displaying a confrontational demeanor toward a law enforcement officer. The accusation, typed in cold, bureaucratic Times New Roman, felt like a punch to Carter's gut. He'd seen this script before too many times, and the name of the reporting officer, Sergeant Derek Sullivan, sent a familiar chill down his spine. Aaliyah sat in the front row, her small frame dwarfed by the oversized chair that seemed to swallow her whole. Her braided hair was neatly pulled back, and her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles pressed white against her brown skin. She wore a navy blue dress, chosen carefully by her mother, Keisha Thompson, to signal respectability in a system that often judged her before she spoke. Keisha, 35, sat beside her daughter, one arm draped protectively over Aaliyah's shoulders, the other clutching a manila folder stuffed with evidence of her daughter's innocence. Report cards showing straight A's, a glowing letter from her English teacher, and medical records documenting Aaliyah's social anxiety disorder. Keisha's face was a mask of controlled fury, her jaw set tight as she stared at the empty witness stand, waiting for the man who'd turned her daughter's life upside down. The courtroom door swung open with a deliberate crash, the brass handle striking the wall with a sound that snapped every head in the room to attention. Sergeant Derek Sullivan strode in, his 6 feet 2 inches frame filling the doorway like a storm cloud rolling across a clear sky. His patrol uniform was pressed to military precision, the navy fabric crisp, his badge gleaming under the lights like a talisman of untouchable authority. His duty belt creaked with each step, the leather heavy with the weight of his holster, handcuffs, and taser. At 38, Sullivan carried himself with the swagger of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. His hazel eyes swept the courtroom, assessing it like a battlefield, lingering on Aaliyah with the cold calculation of a predator sizing up prey. When his gaze shifted to Judge Carter, something flickered across his face, not quite disrespect, not yet, but a challenge so subtle it spoke louder than words. This was a man who believed he owned the room and everyone in it. "Your Honor," Sullivan began, his voice flat and commanding, bypassing the usual courtroom pleasantries. He didn't wait for permission to speak, didn't nod to the bailiff or acknowledge the court's protocols. The subject displayed clear defiance during our interaction. She maintained eye contact in a confrontational manner, and failed to comply with my verbal commands in a timely fashion. Carter looked up from the file, his dark eyes meeting Sullivan's with a steadiness that belied the storm brewing inside him. "Sergeant Sullivan," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of 20 years on the bench, "you're referring to a 12-year-old girl who weighs 90 pounds. Could you specify what actions you observed that constituted defiance?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Sullivan's jaw tightened, and for a split second, the mask of professional courtesy slipped, revealing something raw and ugly beneath. "She looked at me like she was challenging my authority," he said, his tone clipped. "In my 12 years on the force, I've learned that kind of stare is a precursor to escalation. You don't wait for a situation to turn violent, you address it early." Carter's pen scratched a note on his legal pad, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "So her looking at you was the crime?" he asked, his voice still level but edged with a sharpening precision. Describe this confrontational behavior in detail, please. Sullivan shifted his weight, the leather of his duty belt squeaking softly. The way she held her head up. The duration of her eye contact. Her refusal to lower her gaze when I gave a lawful order to disperse. These are indicators we're trained to recognize as potential threats. In the gallery, Keisha Thompson felt her daughter's body tense against her arm. Aaliyah's small hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a desperate need for comfort. Keisha's mind flashed back to the incident a week ago, at the bus stop on 5th and Main in the Riverside district. Aaliyah had been waiting with 3 friends, laughing about a school project, when Sullivan's patrol car screeched to a halt. He'd stormed out, barking orders, his hand hovering near his holster as he singled out Aaliyah. "You look down," he'd shouted, his voice cutting through the humid afternoon air. Aaliyah, frozen with fear, hadn't known how to respond. Her eyes, wide with panic, had stayed locked on his, not out of defiance but because her anxiety had rooted her to the spot. Keisha had arrived just as Sullivan was cuffing her daughter, the metal biting into Aaliyah's wrists as she sobbed. "I didn't do anything, Mama." The memory burned in Keisha's chest, a mix of rage and helplessness that made her want to scream in this sacred space where justice was supposed to live. Carter made another note, his pen moving deliberately. He'd seen this dance before, officers using vague terms like defiance and non-compliance to justify actions that reeked of prejudice. Sullivan's name had appeared in his courtroom before, always in cases involving black children, always with the same polished language that masked uglier truths. The pattern was unmistakable, but it was the personal edge in Sullivan's tone today that set Carter's instincts on high alert. This wasn't just about Aaliyah. This was about a white officer challenging a black judge's right to question his authority. Michael Carter had never set out to be a family court judge. At 30, fresh out of law school at Howard University, he'd envisioned himself in criminal court, prosecuting headline-grabbing cases that would cement his name in legal history. But life had other plans. 10 years as a prosecutor in Philadelphia taught him that the real battles were fought in quieter rooms, where the stakes weren't prison sentences but the safety of children who had no one else to speak for them. His own childhood in West Philly had been an education no law school could match. At 9, he'd sat in a courtroom much like this one, watching his mother, a single parent working 2 jobs, plead for a restraining order against his abusive father. The judge, a white man with a bored expression, had dismissed her case for lack of sufficient evidence, leaving Michael and his mother to navigate the fallout alone. That memory of feeling invisible in a system meant to protect him had shaped every decision he'd made since. When the family court appointment came 10 years ago, Carter accepted it as a calling. His office told the story of that shift. No diplomas or awards adorned the walls, only crayon drawings from children he'd helped escape dangerous homes, thank you letters from mothers who'd found safety, and a single framed photo of his family, his wife, Dr. Lena Carter, a trauma surgeon, and their son Malcolm, now 27 and a civil rights attorney in D.C. A small wooden gavel sat on his desk, a gift from his first family court case, engraved with the words, "Justice begins with listening." Carter lived by those words, keeping his courtroom warm in winter and cool in summer, knowing that comfort could mean the difference between a child speaking truthfully or shrinking into silence. This morning, as he reviewed Aaliyah's file, Carter felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always preceded a difficult case. Sullivan's report was too clean, too rehearsed, filled with phrases like officer safety and escalation potential that often hid more than they revealed. He'd seen Sullivan's name in at least a dozen cases over the past 3 years, all involving black youth, all with similar charges that seemed to evaporate under scrutiny. Carter had made discreet inquiries with colleagues, uncovering whispers of Sullivan's reputation, a decorated officer with commendations for community service, but also a man whose methods raised eyebrows among those who dared to question. The problem was few did. Sullivan's reports were thorough, his supervisors loyal, and the system had a way of closing ranks around its own. In the gallery, a low murmur rippled as Sullivan's testimony continued. Near the back, Jamal Wright, a 32-year-old investigative reporter for the Metro Herald, scribbled notes on a legal pad. He'd come to cover a routine juvenile hearing, hoping for a human interest story, but the tension in the room was electric, hinting at something bigger. Jamal had covered police misconduct before, and Sullivan's demeanor, the casual arrogance, the way he leaned into his words felt like a story waiting to break. His pen moved faster, capturing every detail of Sullivan's testimony. Beside him, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, a 68-year-old retired teacher, sat with her arms crossed, her lips pressed tight. She'd come to support a neighbor's custody case but found herself drawn into Aaliyah's hearing. Evelyn had raised 3 black sons in Riverside, teaching them to keep their hands visible and their voices low when dealing with police. Sullivan's words about defiance hit her like a slap, reminding her of the fear she'd felt every time her boys left the house. She whispered to the woman beside her, "This ain't right. That man's got no business judging a child like that." Carter's voice pulled the room back to attention. "Sergeant Sullivan, let's be clear. You cited a 12-year-old for looking at you. Did she make any verbal threats? Any physical movements that suggested aggression?" Sullivan's eyes narrowed, his irritation barely concealed. "No verbal threats, Your Honor." But her posture head up, eyes locked, was confrontational. "In my training, we're taught to read body language. Kids like her, they test boundaries. If you don't correct it early, it escalates." "Kids like her," Carter repeated, his tone deceptively mild. "What exactly do you mean by that, Sergeant?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine, sharp and deliberate. Sullivan hesitated, sensing the trap, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Kids who think they don't have to respect authority," he said, his voice carrying a faint edge of defiance. "In Riverside, we see it a lot. You let it slide and next thing you know you've got bigger problems." The courtroom doors opened again, this time admitting Sarah Jenkins, a young public defender who'd been assigned to Aaliyah's case. She hurried to her table, her arms full of files, her face flushed from running across the courthouse. Sarah, 29, was new to family court but known for her tenacity. She'd spent the past week digging into Sullivan's history, and what she'd found had kept her up at night. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves, "I'd like to request a brief recess to present new evidence relevant to the officer's credibility." Sullivan's head snapped toward her, his eyes flashing with something close to panic. "This is about the Thompson case," he snapped. "What's she trying to pull?" Carter raised a hand, silencing him. "Miss Jenkins, what kind of evidence?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Documents and testimony suggesting a pattern of selective enforcement by Sergeant Sullivan, particularly against black minors in Riverside." The room erupted in whispers. Keisha's heart pounded as she realized someone else saw what she'd seen. The injustice that had targeted her daughter wasn't isolated. Carter's eyes flicked to Sullivan, whose face had gone rigid. "We'll proceed with the testimony," Carter said, his voice calm but unyielding. "But Miss Jenkins, I expect that evidence on my desk by noon." Sullivan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I've been patrolling Riverside for 12 years. I know these kids, these neighborhoods. I'm out there keeping people safe while you sit up there judging from a file. You don't know what it's like on the streets." The words landed like a challenge, not just to Carter's authority but to his very presence on the bench. The gallery fell silent, every eye on the judge. Carter removed his glasses, cleaning them with deliberate care, a gesture that gave him time to process the insult. When he spoke, his voice was low but carried the weight of a man who'd spent decades earning his place. "Sergeant Sullivan, you will address this court with respect, or you'll find yourself in contempt. Your experience doesn't give you the right to criminalize a child's existence. Now answer my question. What specific actions did Aaliyah Thompson take that justified handcuffing her?" Sullivan's face flushed red, his hands clenching at his sides. "She didn't move when I told her to. She stood there staring like she was daring me to do something. That's not how law-abiding citizens behave." Keisha couldn't hold back anymore. "She was scared," she blurted, her voice cracking with emotion. "My baby was terrified, and you put cuffs on her like she was some criminal." Carter raised a hand, his eyes softening as they met Keisha's. "Miss Thompson, I understand your distress. Please, let's keep this orderly." But Keisha's outburst had shifted something in the room. The other observers, parents, social workers, court staff leaned forward, their faces reflecting a shared recognition of the stakes. This wasn't just about Aaliyah. This was about every black child who'd ever been targeted for existing. Jamal Wright's pen flew across his notepad, his journalist's instincts screaming that this was no ordinary hearing. He'd covered enough police misconduct stories to recognize the signs, the defensive posture, the vague justifications, the assumption of immunity. But Sullivan's brazenness, his willingness to challenge a judge so openly, was something new. Jamal texted his editor, "Get a photographer down here. This is big." Carter leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He'd faced hostility before defense attorneys who pushed boundaries, prosecutors who played politics, but Sullivan's attitude was different. It was personal, a direct challenge to his authority as a black man in a position of power. Carter had spent his career proving he belonged here, earning respect through fairness and an unyielding commitment to justice. But he knew the system wasn't always fair in return. Sullivan's words, his tone, his very presence in this courtroom felt like a dare. "Go ahead, Judge. Try to hold me accountable." The tension was broken by a sharp knock at the courtroom door. Lisa Nguyen, the 28-year-old legal assistant, entered, her arms laden with files. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her eyes carried a quiet intensity that matched Carter's. She'd been with the court for 5 years, long enough to know its rhythms, its secrets, and its failures. Over the past 6 months, she'd been compiling data on Sullivan's cases, driven by a nagging sense that something was wrong. She'd mentioned her concerns to colleagues, only to be met with shrugs or warnings to stay in her lane. But watching Sullivan now, seeing the way he loomed over Aaliyah's small frame, Lisa felt a fire ignite in her chest. She approached Carter's bench, her voice low but urgent. "Your Honor, I need to speak with you privately. It's about this case and others like it." Carter's eyes flicked to hers, reading the determination in her expression. "After this session, Ms. Nguyen," he said, but his tone signaled he understood the weight of her words. Sullivan watched the exchange, his eyes narrowing, as if sensing a threat he couldn't yet name. The courtroom clock ticked toward 10 a.m., and Carter knew this hearing was about to become something far bigger than a single charge against a 12-year-old girl. This was about a system that had allowed men like Sullivan to operate unchecked for too long, and about whether he, Michael Carter, had the courage to confront it head-on. As the session continued, a minor commotion erupted in the gallery. A man in a gray suit, a social worker named Marcus Tate, stood abruptly, his face tight with frustration. "Your Honor, I've seen this before," he said, ignoring the bailiff's gesture to sit. "Sullivan's been targeting kids in Riverside for years. Last month, he cited my nephew for loitering. He was just walking home from basketball practice." The bailiff moved toward Marcus, but Carter raised a hand. "Let him speak," he said, his voice calm but firm. Marcus took a breath, his hands shaking. "These kids aren't criminals. They're just living their lives. Why is it always our kids getting dragged in here?" Sullivan's face darkened, but he held his tongue, his eyes darting to Carter as if daring him to entertain the accusation. Carter made a note, his mind racing. Marcus's outburst wasn't just a disruption, it was a crack in the facade. A signal that the community was watching, waiting for someone to listen. Keisha's eyes met Marcus's across the room, a silent acknowledgement of shared pain. Aaliyah, still clutching her mother's hand, looked up at Carter, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. For the first time she felt seen, not as a subject, but as a person. Carter closed Aaliyah's file, his decision made. This case wasn't just about one girl anymore. It was about a pattern, a system, and a man who believed he was untouchable. "Sergeant Sullivan," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade, "you'll return to the witness stand after the lunch recess. I expect detailed answers about your actions, not just in this case, but in every case you've handled in Riverside. This court will get to the truth, no matter how long it takes." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the room exhaled. But the tension lingered, thick and electric, as if everyone present understood that courtroom 3C was no longer just a place of law, it was a battleground where justice itself was on trial. Sullivan stood, his face a mask of barely controlled rage, and strode out, his boots echoing on the marble floor. Keisha pulled Aaliyah close, whispering, "It's gonna be okay, baby. He can't hurt you anymore." But both of them knew the fight was far from over. Jamal Wright slipped out to call his editor, his heart pounding with the certainty that he was witnessing history. Lisa Nguyen gathered her files, her resolve hardening. Evelyn Brooks clasped her hands, praying for the strength to see this through. And Michael Carter, alone at his bench, felt the weight of every child he'd ever sworn to protect. The truth was out there waiting to be uncovered, and he would not rest until it was brought into the light. The lunch recess in courtroom 3C of the Jefferson County Family Court did nothing to dissipate the electric tension that had crackled through the morning session. The air remained thick, heavy with the unspoken truths that hung like storm clouds over the marble floors and scuffed benches. The fluorescent lights buzzed incessantly, their hum a constant reminder of the institutional weight pressing down on everyone present. It was 12:45 p.m. on that humid July day in 2025, and the courtroom, though momentarily empty, seemed to pulse with the echoes of Sergeant Derek Sullivan's defiant words and Judge Michael Carter's unyielding resolve. The case of 12-year-old Aaliyah Thompson, charged with disorderly conduct for daring to look a police officer in the eye, had become a crucible for something far larger, a reckoning with a system that had long protected its own at the expense of the vulnerable. Judge Michael Carter sat alone in his chambers, the door closed against the chaos of the courthouse. His desk, cluttered with case files and a cooling cup of black coffee, was a testament to the weight of his work. The faint outline of a red mark lingered on his cheek, not from any physical blow but from the sting of Sullivan's words. "You don't know what it's like on the streets," a challenge that cut deeper than any fist could. Carter removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose as he stared at the manila folder before him. Aaliyah's case file, a thin collection of papers that held the story of a child caught in a web of prejudice. He'd seen too many files like this over his 20 years on the bench, each one a reminder of the children who looked to him for protection. But this case felt different, personal, as if the universe had chosen this moment to test his commitment to the words engraved on the small wooden gavel by his side. Justice begins with listening. Outside in the courthouse hallway, Keisha Thompson stood with Aaliyah pressed close to her side. The 35-year-old nurse, her scrub swapped for a navy blazer to signal respectability, clutched her daughter's hand as if it were a lifeline. Aaliyah's eyes, wide and searching, darted toward every passing figure: court clerks, attorneys, security officers, as if expecting Sullivan to reappear at any moment. Keisha whispered, "You're safe, baby. I'm right here." But her words felt hollow against the memory of that day at the bus stop, when Sullivan's voice had boomed like thunder, his hand hovering near his gun as he'd cuffed her trembling daughter. Keisha's folder of evidence, report cards, medical records, letters from teachers felt like a shield too flimsy to protect Aaliyah from a system that seemed designed to break her. In the gallery, waiting for the afternoon session to begin, Jamal Wright, the 32-year-old investigative reporter for the Metro Herald, paced near the courtroom doors. His phone buzzed with messages from his editor, urging him to file a preliminary story, but Jamal knew this was no ordinary hearing. Sullivan's arrogance, the way he'd challenged Carter's authority, hinted at a deeper rot. Jamal had covered police misconduct before, excessive force cases, questionable arrests, but the raw edge in Sullivan's voice, the way he dismissed Aaliyah as a threat, suggested a story that could shift the city's conscience. He typed a quick text to his photographer, "Get here now. This is about to explode." Lisa Nguyen, the 28-year-old legal assistant, sat at her desk in the corner of the courtroom, her laptop open to a folder labeled Sullivan Patterns. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, her fingers trembling slightly as she organized a stack of files she'd spent months compiling. For 6 months, Lisa had been tracking Sullivan's cases, driven by a nagging sense that something was profoundly wrong. Each file told a similar story. Black children, ages 10 to 17, cited for vague offenses like disorderly conduct or failure to comply. The reports were always polished, professional, but the patterns were undeniable. Sullivan targeted black youth with a precision that felt deliberate. Lisa had raised her concerns with colleagues, only to be met with warnings to stay out of it. But watching Sullivan in court that morning, seeing the way he loomed over Aaliyah's small frame, had ignited something fierce in her. She wasn't just a clerk anymore, she was a witness to a truth that demanded to be heard. The courtroom doors opened, and the observers trickled back in, their faces a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, the 68-year-old retired teacher, took her seat near the back, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She'd come to support a neighbor but stayed for Aaliyah, her heart heavy with memories of her own sons navigating a world that saw them as threats before they were men. Beside her, Marcus Tate, the social worker who'd spoken out that morning, sat with his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the empty witness stand. His outburst about his nephew's unjust citation had been impulsive, but it had felt like a release, a crack in the silence he'd kept for too long. Sarah Jenkins, the 29-year-old public defender, hurried to her table, her arms full of files she'd spent the recess organizing. Her research into Sullivan's history had unearthed troubling patterns, but she'd also received a cryptic call from a former colleague in the police department, hinting at evidence that could change everything. Sarah's heart raced as she glanced at Lisa, who gave her a subtle nod. They were allies now, bound by a shared mission to expose the truth. At precisely 1 p.m., Judge Carter re-entered the courtroom, his black robe flowing as he took his place at the bench. The room fell silent, every eye on him. His face was calm, but those who knew him, Sarah could see the steel in his posture, the resolve of a man who'd spent decades fighting for justice in rooms like this. "Court is back in session," he said, his voice steady but carrying a new edge. "Sergeant Sullivan, please return to the witness stand." Sullivan strode forward, his uniform still crisp, his badge catching the light like a shield. But there was a slight hesitation in his step, a flicker of unease in his hazel eyes. He settled into the witness chair, his broad shoulders filling the space, his hands resting casually on the armrests as if to project unshakable confidence. But Carter saw through the facade. He'd faced men like Sullivan before, officers who believed their badges granted them immunity from scrutiny. Today that belief would be tested. "Sergeant Sullivan," Carter began, his voice measured but sharp, "this morning you testified that Aaliyah Thompson's eye contact constituted a threat. I'd like to revisit your broader policing practices in the Riverside District. How many juveniles have you cited in the past 3 years?" Sullivan's eyebrows rose slightly, as if surprised by the shift in focus, but he recovered quickly. "I don't keep exact counts, Your Honor," he said, his tone smooth. "Maybe 50 or 60. Most are minor infractions. Kids learn their lesson and move on." Carter made a note, his pen moving deliberately. "And of those 50 or 60 citations, what percentage involved black juveniles?" The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the courtroom. Sullivan's confident expression flickered, and he glanced toward the prosecution table, as if expecting support that wasn't there. "I don't track race," he said, his voice tighter now. "I respond to behavior, not demographics." Carter leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Sullivan's. "That's admirable, Sergeant, but surely you can estimate. Half, 3/4. Sullivan shifted in his chair, the leather of his duty belt creaking audibly. "It's a diverse area, Your Honor. My citations reflect the population I serve." According to census data, Carter said, consulting a document Lisa had slipped onto his bench, Riverside is 40% black, 35% white, 20% Hispanic, and 5% other. Would you say your citations align with that breakdown? The mathematical precision of the question left no room for deflection. Sullivan's jaw tightened, his hands clenching the armrests. "I don't think racial percentages are relevant here," he said, an edge of irritation creeping into his voice. "We're talking about one incident, one kid who acted inappropriately." Carter's voice remained calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "Actually, Sergeant, we're talking about your credibility as a law enforcement officer. A pattern of behavior is absolutely relevant. So I'll ask again. What percentage of your juvenile citations involved black children?" The courtroom held its breath. Sullivan's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the room felt charged with the same dangerous energy that precedes a lightning strike. "Most of them," he said finally, the words forced through clenched teeth. "But that's because kids in that neighborhood, minority kids, are more likely to show disrespect toward authority. It's a cultural problem, not a policing one." The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Keisha Thompson's grip on Aaliyah's hand tightened, her heart pounding with a mix of fury and vindication. Aaliyah, her eyes fixed on the floor, whispered, "Mama, why does he hate us?" Keisha leaned down, her voice fierce but soft. "He doesn't know us, baby. He's scared of what he doesn't understand." In the gallery, Jamal Wright's pen froze mid-sentence. Sullivan had just confessed to racial bias on the record, in open court with a clarity that would make headlines. He typed a quick note on his phone. Officer admits targeting black kids cultural problem? Mrs. Evelyn Brooks clasped her hands tighter, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Marcus Tate leaned forward, his fists clenched, as if ready to jump up again. Carter removed his glasses, cleaning them with deliberate care, a gesture that gave him time to process the magnitude of Sullivan's admission. A cultural problem, he repeated slowly, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. Could you elaborate, Sergeant? What exactly do you mean by that? Sullivan realized too late that he'd stepped into dangerous territory, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. These kids grow up thinking they don't have to respect authority, he said, his voice rising slightly. Their parents don't teach them how to act around police. Society has to step in or you get chaos, gangs, crime, disrespect. The courtroom erupted in a low murmur of shocked voices, quickly silenced by Carter's raised hand. Keisha felt a fire ignite in her chest. She'd spent Aaliyah's entire life teaching her to be polite, to keep her head down, to survive in a world that saw her as a threat. Hearing Sullivan dismiss her parenting, her community, her daughter's very existence, was like watching justice itself be stripped bare. She wanted to stand, to shout, but Aaliyah's small hand kept her grounded. Lisa Nguyen's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard, pulling up a folder she'd labeled Ellis Case. For months she'd been haunted by the story of Jaden Ellis, a 14-year-old boy shot dead by Sullivan 2 years ago in a Riverside alley. The official report had called it justified force, citing Jaden's alleged aggressive behavior. But Lisa had found inconsistencies, reports rewritten, evidence buried. She'd confided in a colleague, only to be warned that pursuing it could cost her job. But now, watching Sullivan's arrogance, she knew silence wasn't an option. Your Honor, Lisa said, standing abruptly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. I have evidence relevant to Sergeant Sullivan's pattern of behavior with black youth. Sullivan's head snapped toward her, his eyes widening with something that might have been fear. This is about Thompson, he snapped, his voice louder now. Whatever she's digging up has nothing to do with this case. Carter's eyes flicked to Lisa, reading the resolve in her posture. What evidence, Miss Nguyen? He asked, his tone calm but urgent. Lisa took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she opened her laptop. Body camera footage from the Jaden Ellis incident 2 years ago. The original footage, before it was ruled inadmissible due to technical issues. The courtroom fell silent, every eye on Lisa. Sullivan's face went pale, his hands gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles whitened. That footage was sealed, he said, his voice low and dangerous. If you have it, you're breaking the law. Lisa met his gaze unflinching. It was leaked to me by someone who couldn't live with the cover-up, she said, her voice growing stronger. Someone who knew the truth was too important to stay buried. Carter felt the weight of history settle over his courtroom. Whatever was on that video would either vindicate Sullivan or destroy him. There was no middle ground. Play the footage, he said, his voice quiet but final. The large monitor on the courtroom wall flickered to life, its blank screen reflecting the faces of people who knew they were about to witness something that would change everything. The video began with the jerky, low-resolution quality of body camera footage. The timestamp read July 12, 2023, 7:42 p.m., in a dimly lit alley in Riverside. Sullivan's voice crackled through the speakers, younger but unmistakable. Subject is fleeing the scene. In pursuit on foot. The camera bounced as Sullivan ran, showing glimpses of a slight figure in a hoodie darting between parked cars. The figure stumbled, fell, and the camera caught a clear view of Jaden Ellis's face, 14 years old, terrified, his hands raised in surrender. Please don't shoot. Jaden's voice was high, desperate. I didn't do anything. I was just walking home. Sullivan's recorded voice was cold, professional. Subject is resisting arrest. Preparing to deploy force. But the video told a different story. Jaden wasn't resisting. He was cowering, his hands visible, backing away with slow, careful movements, his eyes wide with fear. The disconnect between Sullivan's narration and the visual evidence was stark, undeniable. Subject reaching for potential weapon, Sullivan's voice continued, but the camera showed Jaden's empty hands raised above his head, his body pressed against a chain-link fence. The courtroom watched in horrified silence as Sullivan fired 2 shots into Jaden's chest from less than 8 feet away. Jaden's body crumpled, his final words barely audible through the speakers. "Tell my mom I'm sorry." The video froze on Jaden's face, his eyes open, lifeless, a boy who'd been buying a soda for his little sister moments before. Keisha Thompson stifled a sob, pulling Aaliyah closer. Aaliyah's body shook, her small voice whispering, "That could have been me." In the gallery, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Marcus Tate's fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. Jamal Wright activated his phone's recording app, knowing this moment would dominate headlines for months. Sullivan's face was ashen, his earlier arrogance replaced by a desperate look of a man watching his world collapse. "That video's out of context," he protested, his voice cracking. "There were gang reports in the area. You can't judge a split-second decision." Lisa, undeterred, projected a police report onto the monitor. "No gang activity noted," she said, her voice steady. "No weapon found. Jaden Ellis was carrying a receipt for a soda and a bag of chips." Carter leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Sullivan's. "Sergeant, you claimed Jaden Ellis was a threat. He was unarmed, surrendering, begging for his life. Explain that." Sullivan's breathing became audible, short and sharp. "It was dark. I thought he was reaching for something. You don't know what it's like out there." The tension was broken by a new voice from the gallery. "That's a lie." A man stood, his face familiar to Carter. David Reese, a former Riverside beat cop who'd resigned a year ago. At 45, David's hair was streaked with gray, his eyes haunted by what he'd seen on the job. "Your Honor, I worked with Sullivan. He rewrote reports to cover his tracks. Jaden's wasn't the first." The courtroom gasped, and Sullivan's face twisted with rage. "You're a traitor, Reese," he shouted, but David didn't flinch. "I kept quiet too long. Jaden was a good kid. You murdered him." Carter raised a hand, silencing the room. "Mr. Reese, you'll have a chance to testify. For now, Sergeant Sullivan, I want to know how many other cases like Jaden Ellis's are buried in your files." Sullivan's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. "I followed protocol," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Lisa, sensing the moment, pulled up another file. "Your Honor, I've cross-referenced Sullivan's cases. Over 3 years, 95% of his juvenile citations targeted black children, despite Riverside's 40% black population. I have 41 cases with similar language-defiant posture. Failure to comply, all dismissed or plea bargain to avoid scrutiny." She projected a chart, the numbers stark and damning. Sarah Jenkins stood, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "Your Honor, I've spoken with a whistleblower from the police department. They confirm Sullivan's supervisors routinely approved his reports without question, even when evidence contradicted them. I move to admit this testimony and the footage as evidence of a pattern of misconduct." Sullivan's composure cracked. "This is a setup," he shouted, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "You're all trying to make me the bad guy because I do my job." Carter's voice cut through like a blade. "Your job, Sergeant, is to protect, not to terrorize. You've just admitted to targeting black children based on their culture. That's not policing, that's prejudice." The courtroom was a pressure cooker now, every breath heavy with anticipation. Jamal Wright sent a text to his editor. "Officer's bias exposed on record. Video shows murder. This is national news." Mrs. Evelyn Brooks whispered to Marcus, "This is what my boys went through. Someone's finally listening." Keisha held Aaliyah, her heart breaking for Jaden's mother, Latoya Ellis, who'd never gotten her day in court. Carter's mind raced. Jaden's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a symptom of a system that had failed too many children. He thought of his own son, Malcolm, who'd faced similar scrutiny growing up, stopped by police for looking suspicious while walking home from school. The memory fueled his resolve. "Ms. Nguyen," he said, his voice steady but urgent, "what else do you have?" Lisa hesitated, her hands trembling as she opened a new file. "There's more, Your Honor." An audio recording from Sullivan and his supervisor, Lieutenant Rachel Hayes. "It was sent anonymously to my office last week." Sullivan's face went white. "That's illegal," he barked, but Carter raised a hand. "If it's relevant, it's admissible." Play it. The courtroom speakers crackled to life, and Sullivan's voice filled the room, slurred slightly from what sounded like a bar. The problem with policing today is we can't do our jobs properly. Every time we take down one of these thugs, some judge cries about rights. Lieutenant Hayes's laugh followed, chilling in its casual cruelty. Tell me about it. That Ellis kid got what he deserved. Little punk thought he could stare you down. Sullivan's voice grew colder. He learned his lesson. And the others in Riverside got the message too. The recording ended, and the silence was deafening. Keisha's tears fell silently, Aaliyah clinging to her. Jamal's phone recorded every second, knowing this would spark a firestorm. David Reese nodded, as if the recording confirmed what he'd long suspected. Carter sat back, his hands folded, letting the weight of Sullivan's words settle over the courtroom. This wasn't just about one officer, Anna Marie, it was about a system that had enabled him, protected him, and let a 14-year-old boy die to maintain its silence. The session adjourned for a brief recess, but the truth was out, exposed like a raw nerve. Sullivan remained in his chair, his face a mask of panic and defiance, knowing the footage and recording had stripped away his armor. Carter retreated to his chambers, the weight of Jaden's face etched in his mind. Lisa, Sarah, and David exchanged glances, their resolve hardening. The fight for justice had just begun, and Courtroom 3C was now a battlefield where truth would either triumph or be buried once more. The silence in Courtroom 3C was so profound it seemed to hum louder than the fluorescent lights overhead. The weight of the audio recording Sergeant Derek Sullivan's slurred voice boasting about Jaden Ellis's death, Lieutenant Rachel Hayes's chilling laughter echoing in agreement lingered like a physical presence, pressing against the chests of everyone in the room. It was 2:30 p.m. on that sweltering July day in 2025, and the Jefferson County Family Court had become a crucible where truth and lies collided with the force of a breaking dam. The grainy image of Jaden Ellis's lifeless face, frozen on the courtroom monitor, stared out at the gallery, a silent accusation that demanded justice. Judge Michael Carter sat at his bench, his dark eyes fixed on Sullivan, who remained in the witness chair, his once imposing frame now rigid with the tension of a man cornered. Carter's hands rested on his desk, fingers interlaced, his calm exterior masking the storm within. The recording had stripped away Sullivan's carefully crafted facade, exposing not just one officer's prejudice, but a system that had enabled it. Carter's mind flickered to his own childhood in West Philly, to the nights he'd lain awake listening to his mother's quiet sobs after another failed court hearing. Those memories fueled his resolve now, anchoring him as he prepared to push this case to its breaking point. He adjusted his glasses, his voice steady but edged with a quiet fury. "Sergeant Sullivan," he began, "you've heard the recording. You've seen the footage of Jaden Ellis's death. You claimed he was a threat, yet the evidence shows an unarmed 14-year-old begging for his life. I'll ask again. Explain yourself." Sullivan's face was a mask of barely controlled panic, his hazel eyes darting around the courtroom as if searching for an ally who no longer existed. His hands gripped the armrests of the witness chair, the leather creaking under the pressure. "That recording was private," he said, his voice low and defensive. "It was just talk blowing off steam. You can't use it to paint me as some kind of monster. Jaden Ellis was in a high-crime area, known for gang activity. I made a split-second decision to protect myself and others." Carter leaned forward, his gaze unrelenting. "A split-second decision that ended an unarmed child's life," he said, his words cutting through the room like a blade. "You said Jaden learned his lesson. You and Lieutenant Hayes laughed about using his death to send a message to other children in Riverside. What message exactly were you sending?" The courtroom held its breath. Keisha Thompson, seated in the front row with Aaliyah pressed against her side, felt her heart pound so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Aaliyah's small hand trembled in hers, her eyes fixed on the floor, as if afraid to meet Sullivan's gaze even now. Keisha's mind replayed the bus stop incident, Sullivan's towering figure, his hand on his holster, his voice barking orders at her terrified daughter. The thought that Aaliyah could have been another Jaden, another name on a report, made her want to scream. Instead she whispered, "You're safe now, baby. He can't touch you." In the gallery, Jamal Wright, the 32-year-old reporter for the Metro Herald, scribbled furiously, his legal pad filling with quotes that would dominate front pages across the country. Sullivan's admission of bias, the damning video, and now this recording. These were the kind of revelations that could topple careers, expose corruption, and spark reform. He glanced at his phone, where a live feed of his notes was already being relayed to his editor. Officer confesses to targeting black kids. Video shows murder. Audio reveals cover-up. This is bigger than Watergate. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, the 68-year-old retired teacher, sat with her hands clasped, her lips moving in a silent prayer for justice. Beside her, Marcus Tate, the social worker, leaned forward, his eyes burning with a mix of anger and hope. His nephew's unjust citation last month had been a personal wound, but this moment felt like the beginning of healing, not just for him, but for an entire community. Sullivan's voice rose, a note of desperation creeping in. "You're twisting my words, Your Honor. I never said I targeted anyone because of race. I'm out there every day, risking my life to keep Riverside safe. These kids, they don't respect authority. Their parents don't teach them how to act around police. Someone has to step in or you get chaos, gangs, drugs, violence." His words echoed his earlier testimony, but now they sounded hollow, desperate, a last-ditch effort to justify the unjustifiable. Carter's voice was ice. "You said these kids need to be taught respect. You said Jaden's death sent a message. Who are these kids, Sergeant? Be specific." The question was a trap, and Sullivan knew it. His face flushed red, his hands clenching into fists. "You know what I mean," he said, his voice low but venomous. "Kids in Riverside who think they can challenge cops and get away with it. You people always make it about race when it's about behavior." The phrase "you people" landed like a grenade, igniting the courtroom. Gasps rippled through the gallery, and Keisha's breath caught in her throat. Aaliyah's eyes widened, her small body shrinking further into her mother's side. Jamal's pen froze, his heart racing as he realized Sullivan had just handed him a quote that would echo across the nation. Evelyn Brooks shook her head, muttering, "Lord, give us strength." Marcus Tate's fists tightened, his voice barely audible as he whispered, "He said it. He actually said it." Carter removed his glasses, setting them down with deliberate care. The room was silent, every eye on him waiting for his response. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with a fire that spoke of decades spent proving his worth in a world that questioned it. "Sergeant Sullivan," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "you just referred to me and presumably others in this courtroom as you people. You've admitted to targeting black children for their culture, laughed about a boy's death, and now you've insulted this court. Do you have anything to say before I proceed?" Sullivan's composure shattered. His face contorted with rage, and he leaned forward, his voice rising to a shout. "You're turning this into a witch hunt. I've been a cop for 12 years, putting my life on the line while you sit up there in your robe, protecting your own kind instead of the law." The words echoed off the marble walls, and for a moment time seemed to stop. The gallery froze, the bailiff's hand moved to his holster, and Lisa Nguyen's laptop screen flickered as she paused her typing, stunned by the outburst. Before Carter could respond, Sullivan lurched from the witness chair, his 6 feet 2 inches frame towering as he took 2 steps toward the bench. In a flash of unchecked fury, he swung his open hand, striking Carter across the face with a crack that reverberated like a gunshot. The courtroom erupted in chaos, gasps, shouts, the scrape of chairs as observers stood. Keisha pulled Aaliyah into her arms, shielding her from the scene. Jamal's phone camera was already recording, capturing every second of the assault. Evelyn Brooks cried out, "No, Lord, no." Marcus Tate surged to his feet, only to be restrained by a neighbor. The bailiff, a burly man named Tom Harris, moved to intercept Sullivan, but Carter raised a hand, his voice cutting through the pandemonium. "Stand down," he said, his tone unshaken despite the red mark blooming on his cheek. "Let the record show that Sergeant Derek Sullivan assaulted a sitting judge after confessing to racial bias and complicity in the death of Jaden Ellis." His words were calm, deliberate, a beacon of authority in the storm. Sullivan froze, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with the realization of what he'd done. The bailiff grabbed his arm, but Sullivan yanked free, turning to the gallery as if seeking an ally. "You all know how it is out there," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm the one keeping you safe. You think these kids are innocent? They're trouble waiting to happen. His words were met with stunned silence, save for a low murmur from Evelyn, who whispered, "You're the trouble, son." Lisa Nguyen stood, her voice trembling but firm. "Your Honor, I have additional evidence, a second audio file, recorded 3 months after Jaden's death." Sullivan's head snapped toward her, his face a mask of panic. "You can't do this," he shouted, but Carter silenced him with a look. "Play it, Ms. Nguyen," he said, his voice steady despite the sting on his cheek. The speakers crackled again and Sullivan's voice filled the room, this time clearer, more sober. "Hayes, we need to make sure the Ellis case stays buried. If that footage gets out, we're done." Hayes's voice replied, cold and calculating. "Don't worry. The captain's got our back. Just keep the pressure on Riverside, keep those kids in line." The recording ended, and the courtroom was a powder keg, every breath heavy with the weight of betrayal. Carter's eyes never left Sullivan's. "You conspired to cover up a murder," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of a gavel. "You used Jaden Ellis's death to intimidate other children. This court will not tolerate such corruption." Sullivan sank back into the witness chair, his defiance crumbling under the weight of the evidence. The courtroom doors burst open and Special Agent Emily Torres, a 40-year-old FBI investigator, strode in, flanked by 2 agents in dark suits. Her face was stern, her badge gleaming as she held up a warrant. "Derek Sullivan, you're under arrest for civil rights violations, second-degree murder, and obstruction of justice." The bailiff moved to cuff Sullivan, who struggled briefly, his voice rising in desperation. "This is a setup. You're all in on it." But his protests were drowned out by the click of handcuffs and the murmurs of the gallery. As Sullivan was led away, his boots echoing on the marble floor, Carter turned to Lieutenant Hayes's empty seat in the gallery. "Agent Torres," he said, "I assume you have a warrant for Lieutenant Rachel Hayes as well?" Torres nodded, her voice clipped. "She was apprehended 20 minutes ago at a community event in Riverside. She's in custody." The courtroom exhaled, the tension breaking like a wave. Keisha Thompson held Aaliyah close, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "It's over, baby. You're free." Aaliyah's small voice was barely audible. "What about Jaden's mom? Does she know?" Keisha's heart broke at the question, knowing that LaToya Ellis, Jaden's mother, was somewhere out there, still grieving a loss this courtroom could only begin to address. Jamal Wright's phone buzzed with notifications, his editor, colleagues, even national outlets picking up his live feed. He typed a quick update. "Officer arrested in court after assaulting judge. Second officer in custody. Evidence of systemic corruption exposed." Mrs. Evelyn Brooks reached for Marcus Tate's hand, her voice soft but firm. "This is what justice looks like when we fight for it." Marcus nodded, his eyes glistening. "For my nephew. For Jaden. For all of them." Sarah Jenkins, the public defender, gathered her files, her hands shaking with adrenaline. She'd known Sullivan's history was troubling, but the scale of his actions, and the system that had protected him, was staggering. She exchanged a glance with Lisa, who was closing her laptop, her face pale but resolute. They'd taken a risk and it had paid off, but the cost was etched in the faces of everyone in the room. David Reese, the former cop, remained standing, his eyes fixed on the spot where Sullivan had been cuffed. He'd left the force because of men like Sullivan, men who twisted the badge into a weapon. Speaking out today had been his redemption, a way to honor Jaden's memory and protect kids like Aaliyah. He caught Carter's eye and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of shared purpose. Carter leaned back in his chair, his hand brushing the small wooden gavel on his desk. The mark on his cheek throbbed, but it was a small price to pay for the truth now laid bare. He thought of his son Malcolm, who'd texted him during the recess. "Dad, you're doing what I could only dream of. Keep fighting." The words had grounded him, reminding him why he stayed in family court, why he refused to let children like Jaden and Aaliyah be forgotten. But the fight wasn't over. Sullivan's arrest was only the beginning. The evidence Lisa had uncovered 41 cases of questionable citations, a pattern of targeting black youth pointed to a rot that went deeper than one officer. Hayes's involvement suggested a conspiracy, and Carter knew the FBI's presence meant this case would ripple far beyond Jefferson County. He made a note to request a full review of Sullivan's cases, knowing each file represented a child whose life had been altered by a system that failed them. As the courtroom began to clear, Carter's eyes fell on Aaliyah, who was looking at him for the first time that day. Her expression wasn't just fear or relief, it was trust, fragile but real. He nodded to her, a small gesture that carried the weight of a promise. "I see you. I won't let you down." Keisha caught his gaze and mouthed, "Thank you," her eyes glistening with gratitude and exhaustion. The session adjourned, but the air remained charged, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the day's events. Jamal slipped out to meet his photographer, already drafting the story that would dominate the news cycle. Lisa gathered her files, her heart pounding with the realization that her work had changed lives. Evelyn and Marcus lingered, talking quietly about the community meeting they'd organized to keep the pressure on. Sarah headed to her office to prepare for the next phase, ensuring Aaliyah's charges were dismissed and supporting the families of Sullivan's other victims. Carter remained at his bench, alone for a moment as the courtroom emptied. He touched the red mark on his cheek, a reminder of the cost of truth. Jaden Ellis's face lingered in his mind, joined now by Aaliyah's, and countless others who'd passed through this courtroom. This wasn't just a case, it was a turning point. A chance to dismantle a system that had failed too many for too long. He stood, his robe heavy with the weight of responsibility, and walked to his chambers, ready to face whatever came next. The echoes of the gavel still seemed to reverberate in courtroom 3C as the late afternoon sun filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the empty benches. It was 4:15 p.m. on July 6, 2025, and the Jefferson County Family Court, once a crucible of confrontation, now felt like a sacred space where truth had clawed its way into the light. The arrest of Sergeant Derek Sullivan, handcuffed and led away after assaulting Judge Michael Carter, and the apprehension of Lieutenant Rachel Hayes had ripped the veil off a system that had shielded corruption for too long. The air, heavy with the day's revelations, carried a quiet promise. Justice, though delayed, was no longer silent. For Aaliyah Thompson, Keisha, and the community of Riverside, this was not the end but a beginning, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. Judge Michael Carter sat at his bench, the courtroom now empty save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant murmur of courthouse staff in the hallway. The red mark on his cheek, left by Sullivan's impulsive slap, had faded to a dull ache, but its significance burned brighter than ever. It was a badge of defiance against a system that had allowed men like Sullivan to prey on the vulnerable. Carter's hands rested on the small wooden gavel inscribed with "Justice begins with listening," a gift from a mother whose child he'd saved from foster care years ago. He traced the words with his thumb, his mind heavy with the weight of what had transpired. Jaden Ellis's face frozen in that grainy body cam footage, eyes wide with Fullingard in his thoughts, joined by Aaliyah's trembling trust and the countless others whose stories were buried in Sullivan's files. This wasn't just a victory. It was a mandate to keep fighting. Outside in the courthouse plaza, Keisha Thompson stood with Aaliyah, the humid July air clinging to their skin. Aaliyah's navy dress was wrinkled now, her braids slightly loosened from the day's tension, but her eyes held a new light of fragile courage born from being seen, truly seen, by a judge who refused to look away. Keisha clutched her daughter's hand, her manila folder of evidence tucked under her arm like a talisman. The charges against Aaliyah had been dismissed within minutes of Sullivan's arrest, Carter's voice steady as he declared, "This court finds no basis for the accusation of disorderly conduct." But the victory felt bittersweet. Keisha's heart ached for Latoya Ellis, Jaden's mother, who'd lost her son to the same man who'd tried to criminalize her daughter. "We're going home, baby," Keisha whispered, pulling Aaliyah close. "But we're not done yet." In the hours that followed Sullivan's arrest, the Riverside district became a hive of activity. FBI agents, led by Special Agent Emily Torres, descended on 3 precincts, their black SUVs lining the streets as they executed search warrants. Filing cabinets were emptied, computers seized, and body cam footage previously lost or corrupted was recovered from hidden servers. The raids uncovered a trove of evidence. Altered reports, deleted emails, and internal memos revealing a culture of complicity that reached far beyond Sullivan and Hayes. 39 officers were suspended pending investigation, their badges turned in under the watchful eyes of federal agents. The Riverside Police Department's training program, long touted as a model for community policing, was halted, its curriculum now under scrutiny for perpetuating bias. Carter wasted no time. From his chambers, he drafted an order establishing a special review board with subpoena power to examine every juvenile case handled by Sullivan over the past 5 years. Leeson Wenz files 41 cases of questionable citations, all targeting black youth, became the board's starting point. Each file was a story. A 10-year-old cited for loitering while waiting for a school bus, a 16-year-old charged with resisting, for asking why he was stopped, a 13-year-old girl accused of disorderly conduct, for raising her voice in fear. Carter knew these weren't just numbers. They were children whose futures had been stolen by a system that saw them as threats rather than people. He appointed Sarah Jenkins, the tenacious public defender, to lead the board, trusting her to pursue justice with the same ferocity she'd shown in court. Sarah, still reeling from the day's events, sat in her cramped office across the courthouse, her desk buried under files. At 29, she'd never imagined her first year in family court would lead to a case that could redefine justice in Riverside. The whistleblower who'd tipped her off about Sullivan's history, a retired sergeant named Carla Ruiz, had called during the recess, her voice heavy with relief. "You did it, Sarah," she'd said. "You made them listen." But Sarah knew the work was just beginning. She spent the evening drafting motions to reopen Sullivan's cases, her hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She thought of Aaliyah, of Jaden, and of the families who deserved answers. This was her fight now, and she wouldn't back down. Jamal Wright, the Metro Herald reporter, was already a block away, hunched over his laptop in a coffee shop as he filed his story. The headline was bold but honest. "Officer arrested after assaulting judge, exposing police corruption in Riverside." His article detailed Sullivan's confession, the damning body cam footage, and the audio recordings that implicated Hayes. By 6 p.m. the story had gone viral, shared across social media platforms and picked up by national outlets. Jamal's phone buzzed with interview requests, CNN, MSNBC, even international networks, but he stayed focused, knowing the real work was in the follow-up. He'd already scheduled interviews with community leaders and planned to track the FBI's investigation. This wasn't just a scoop. It was a chance to amplify voices like Keisha's and Aaliyah's, to hold power accountable. In Riverside, the community was stirring. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, the retired teacher, stood in her living room, addressing a small group of neighbors who'd gathered to plan a response. At 68, Evelyn had seen too many injustices to believe change came easily, but today's events had lit a spark. "We can't stop now," she said, her voice steady. "That courtroom showed us what's possible when we speak up. We need a community oversight board, one with real power to make sure this never happens again." Marcus Tate, the social worker, nodded in agreement, his mind on his nephew, who'd been cited by Sullivan for simply walking home. Marcus volunteered to organize a town hall, determined to turn today's victory into lasting reform. Keisha Thompson joined the meeting, bringing Aaliyah along despite the late hour. She'd hesitated, unsure if her daughter was ready, but Aaliyah had insisted. "I want to help, Mama," she'd said, her voice small but firm. At the meeting, Aaliyah sat quietly, listening as adults debated policy and accountability. But when Evelyn asked if anyone wanted to share, Aaliyah raised her hand. The room fell silent as the 12-year-old stood, her voice trembling at first but growing stronger. "I was scared when that officer stopped me," she said. "I didn't know what I did wrong. But Judge Carter listened, and now I know I'm not invisible. I want other kids to know they're not invisible either." The room erupted in applause and Keisha wiped tears from her eyes, pride swelling in her chest. Aaliyah was no longer just a victim, she was a voice, a spark for change. Across town, Latoya Ellis, Jaden's mother, sat in her small apartment, the walls lined with photos of her son. At 37, Latoya had aged a decade in the 2 years since Jaden's death. The official report had called it justified, and she'd been denied access to the body cam footage, left to grieve with only questions and pain. But today, a call from Sarah Jenkins had changed everything. The case was being reopened as a murder investigation, with Sullivan facing charges. Latoya walked to the community garden she'd planted in Jaden's memory, a small patch of sunflowers and roses outside the Riverside Rec Center. She knelt among the flowers, her fingers brushing the petals, and whispered, "We got him, baby. You're not forgotten." The garden, once a private act of mourning, was becoming a symbol of hope, a place where neighbors gathered to honor Jayden and demand justice. Lisa Nguyen, now back in her apartment, sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open to the case files she'd spent months compiling. The weight of her role in today's events pressed on her, both exhilarating and terrifying. At 28, she'd never expected her quiet work as a legal assistant to spark a reckoning. But exposing Sullivan's pattern had been her rebellion against a system that demanded silence. Her phone pinged with a message from Carter. "You've been promoted to court director. We need you now more than ever." Lisa's heart raced as she realized her work was far from over. She began drafting protocols for a new transparency initiative, ensuring body cam footage could never be buried again. Her hands shook, not with fear but with purpose. She was part of something bigger now, a movement to protect kids like Aaliyah and Jayden. David Reese, the former cop who'd testified against Sullivan, stood outside the courthouse, watching the sunset paint the sky orange. At 45, he'd left the force because he couldn't stomach the cover-ups, the unspoken rules that protected men like Sullivan. Speaking out today had been a risk. His old colleagues had already sent threatening texts, but it was worth it. He thought of Jayden, a boy he'd met once at a community basketball game, all lanky limbs and big dreams. David had promised himself he'd honor Jayden's memory, and today he'd kept that promise. He pulled out his phone and called his daughter, a college freshman, to tell her he was proud of her, of himself, of this moment. Carter, meanwhile, faced a choice. A federal judge position had been offered to him months ago, a prestigious role that would elevate his career. But as he sat in his chambers, the weight of today's events settled over him. Family court was where he belonged here, among the children who needed him most. He thought of his wife, Dr. Lena Carter, who'd supported him through every battle, and his son Malcolm, whose text had reminded him why he fought. Carter declined the federal offer in a brief email, then walked to the courthouse plaza, where a small crowd had gathered around LaToya's garden. He stood quietly, his robe replaced by a simple suit, and listened as neighbors shared stories of their own encounters with injustice. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His presence was enough. The broader impact of the day's events rippled outward. The FBI's investigation expanded, uncovering a network of officers who'd falsified reports to protect Sullivan and Hayes. The Riverside Police Department faced a federal consent decree, mandating reforms to training, oversight, and body cam policies. Community activists, inspired by Aaliyah's courage, launched a campaign for a civilian review board with real authority. Schools in Riverside began workshops on students' rights, led by teachers like Evelyn Brooks, who saw education as a shield against injustice. Aaliyah spoke at one such workshop, her voice steady as she told her story, inspiring her classmates to stand tall. Jamal Wright's reporting earned him a Pulitzer nomination, but he cared more about the families he'd amplified. His follow-up stories detailed the review board's findings, the reopened cases, and the community's push for reform. He visited LaToya's garden, interviewing her for a feature that brought national attention to Jayden's memory. The garden grew, tended by volunteers who saw it as a symbol of resilience. Months later, Sullivan was sentenced to 20 years for murder and civil rights violations. Hayes received 12 years for conspiracy and obstruction. The trials were grueling, but Carter's testimony, calm, precise, unflinching, ensured the truth held firm. Aaliyah, now back at school, wrote a letter to Carter, her handwriting neat and deliberate. "Thank you for seeing me," it read. "I want to be a judge someday like you." Carter kept the letter on his desk, beside the gavel, a reminder of why he stayed. As winter settled over Riverside, Carter stood in the garden with LaToya, the sunflowers now dormant but the roses still blooming. "This is for Jayden," LaToya said, her voice soft but strong. "And for all of us." Carter nodded, his eyes on the horizon. The mark on his cheek was gone, but its lesson endured. Justice was a fight, not a gift, and it began with refusing to look away. Riverside was changing, one voice, one truth, one garden at a time. The story of Courtroom 3C wasn't just a headline night, it was a call to action. For every Aaliyah, every Jayden, every family that had faced a system designed to silence them, it was proof that courage could shift the world. And in that small garden under a cold December sky, the seeds of justice took root, promising a future where no child would be invisible again. All right, folks, Let's take a breather from the heart-pounding drama of Courtroom 3C and talk about what just went down. Picture this. A 12-year-old girl staring down a rogue cop, a judge who refuses to back down, and a community that finally says, enough is enough. This isn't just a story, it's a wake-up call. A reminder that justice isn't some dusty book on a shelf. It's a living, breathing fight that starts with people like you and me. And yeah, I know it's heavy stuff, but let's sprinkle a little humor on it to keep things real, because if we can't laugh at the absurdity of a grown man throwing a tantrum in court, what's the point? Think about it. Sergeant Sullivan thought he could waltz into a courtroom, slap a judge, and walk away like he's the hero in some bad action movie. Spoiler alert. He's not getting an Oscar for ethics. His meltdown was like watching your uncle at Thanksgiving argue he's not wrong about burning the turkey, except, with way higher stakes. The guy was so caught up in his own power trip he forgot the golden rule. Don't mess with a judge who's got truth on speed dial. And Aaliyah? That kid's got more courage in her pinky finger than Sullivan had in his entire badge collection. She stared down a bully and came out stronger. Talk about a plot twist we can all cheer for. But here's where it hits home. This story isn't stuck in 2025 Riverside. It's happening right now in your town, your school, maybe even your group chat. Ever had someone try to shut you down just for being you? Maybe it was a boss who didn't like you asking questions, a teacher who didn't get your vibe, or that one neighbor who glares when you play your music too loud. Sorry, Karen. Beyoncé deserves to be heard. The point is, we've all faced a Sullivan, someone who thinks they can write your story without your input. And like Judge Carter, Lisa, and Aaliyah, it's on us to say, not today. The lesson here? Speak up, stand firm, and don't let anyone dim your light. Because even a 12-year-old can shake up the system when she refuses to stay quiet. Now let's talk 2025 realness. We're living in a world where social media can spark a movement in minutes. Justice for Jaden was trending before Sullivan's handcuffs even clicked. But it's not just hashtags, it's about showing up, whether that's at a community meeting, a school board, or just a family dinner where you call out that one relative's questionable opinions. Gently, of course. It didn't start a food fight. Riverside showed us that change starts when one person, be it a judge, a clerk, or a kid, decides silence isn't an option. And yeah, it's messy, it's scary, and sometimes you get metaphorically slapped in the face, but every voice counts. So what's your story? Have you ever stood up to a bully, big or small? Drop it in the comments. I'm dying to hear how you channeled your inner Aaliyah. And here's a little education with a side of sass. Justice isn't just about winning in court. It's about building a world where kids like Aaliyah and Jaden don't have to fear walking home. It's about asking hard questions like why some people get a pass while others get a target on their back. So next time you see something wrong at work, at school, or even in line at the coffee shop, because yes, cutting the line is a crime against humanity, channel Judge Carter's calm and call it out. You don't need a gavel to make a difference. You just need a spine and maybe a good playlist for courage, Beyoncé, anyone. So what's next? Riverside's story isn't over, and neither is yours. Hit that subscribe button to catch more stories that'll make you laugh, cry, and maybe even stand up a little taller. We're dropping truth bombs and inspiration weekly, so don't miss out unless you're cool with letting Sullivan types run the show, and I know you're not. Tell me in the comments. What's one thing you do to make your community a little more just? And while you're at it, share this story with someone who needs a reminder that courage is contagious. Let's keep the conversation going, because justice starts with us.